Welcome to the Cyber Sangha podcast. Cyber Sangha is a program of free live broadcasts, launched in 2009 by renowned teacher and author Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. Join us as we draw on ancient Tibetan wisdom to discover how to connect with our best self and live to our highest potential. The following conversation, Life Beyond Depression, Finding Healing and Wholeness Through Meditation, happened on March 16th, 2023 as a science and spirituality dialogue with Norman Farb, Juanita Campbell Rasmus, Geshe Tenzin Wangyal, and host Alejandro Chaoul. This was part of a year-long series on embracing life with wisdom and compassion. This content is for informational purposes only. Listeners should consult medical professionals for any physical or mental health concerns. Please use headphones and do not meditate while driving or operating machinery.
Hi everyone, welcome to Cyber Sangha. My name is Alejandro Chaoul and I have the pleasure of hosting this dialogue. And we're entering another year. Our years start with the Tibetan New Year. And so we've been doing these dialogues on the topics of body, breath, and mind. Same with our 24-hour full moon practice and so forth. And this year we are starting different. We're starting with different emotions. And so Rinpoche started the year in March 3rd with a talk on embracing depression and cultivating joy. And we had our 24-hour meditation in that topic away as embracing depression and cultivating joy. And today we have wonderful speakers to talk about life beyond depression, finding healing and wholeness through meditation. And so joining Rinpoche, who's really, I think most of you know him, who's an incredible teacher that trained in India. He's Tibetan, trained in a Tibetan monastery in India, and then came to the West starting in the 80s and then early 90s here in the States. And I've been teaching since, founded the Ligmincha Institute, and amongst other things, many years before COVID, founded Cyber Sangha, which is this space where we all meet, even if we're not in the same place geographically. And so thank you, Rinpoche, for having this and hosting these. And all the programs in Cyber Sangha are free and open. So a great way of reaching out. And today, joining Rinpoche is my good friend and colleague, Juanita Rasmus. And Juanita is a pastor, or actually, we'll talk about that. She's a retiring pastor and rewiring as a new person. We talk about that new stage and becoming this really through her dealing with her own depression, becoming a transformational coach. She's the author of Learning to Be, and she'll talk about that, or how that finding your center after the bottom falls out. And she's really an incredible both person and speaker, and it's a delight to have you here with us, Juanita. Thank you for joining us. And joining us too from Toronto, we have Dr. Norman Farb, who's the Associate Professor of Psychology at University of Toronto and directs the Regulatory and Affective Dynamics Lab there. So he looks at psychology of well-being and focusing on mental habits and how really we can interpret these emotions differently for different people. I know Norm for many years from the Mind and Life Institute, and again, Norm, is a delight to have you here. Thank you for joining. So, as we start, let's start with talking about depression. So many people today have this that we call depression. Sometimes it's diagnosed, sometimes it's just a feeling that feels very different to what we were. Some people talk about I don't feel myself, right? I lose myself. So I wanted to start with you, Juanita. I know you've shared part of your story, and whatever you want to share here from your journey with depression. So, welcome.
I tell you, when I was diagnosed with depression, I was shocked. I didn't have a clue as to what was going on. I just knew that everything that had meant something to me no longer had value. I no longer found humor in anything, and I typically laugh with a degree of ease. Our lives my husband and I, at that point, had just started St. John's. I think at that point we had been in ministry 7 years, and our church had grown rapidly from 9 members to, in 7 years, we had 3,500 members in our congregation. And we were entrepreneurs. And so we were used to juggling lots of balls, trying to juggle our family, trying to juggle our marriage, trying to juggle now this growing, vibrant congregation. And so if you had looked at my life from the outside, you probably would have said, wow, they've got great things happening. Beautiful things are going on in their life. And so in terms of the picture of what my life looked like, depression wasn't on the horizon. But in terms of the internal reality being that here I was, a person who very much was performance driven, very much a type A person, very much a person who believed in getting it done, making it happen, right? And so much was riding on our congregation because it was kind of a gamble that our pastor had turned over to these 2 lay people who basically were just excited about the opportunity to serve and to it was almost like an experiment to see what might happen, right? And the experiment took off. And we weren't necessarily prepared emotionally for the toll that this experience would take on us. And so it was very simple. One morning I woke up, our girls were young. We tried to make sure that every morning that breakfast was special because we may not have gotten together as a family for any other meal beside breakfast. And so I prepared breakfast, hugged everybody, kissed them goodbye. Rudy took the girls to school for me that morning. And I went in the bathroom to finish putting on my makeup. And all of a sudden I just felt terribly sick. It felt as though maybe I was getting the flu or something. It really felt like I'd been hit by a Mack truck. And I couldn't understand why I felt so horrible all of a sudden. But inside, I literally felt like a package of dry spaghetti. And each of those pieces of spaghetti were just popping. And those were my nerves inside. That's what it felt like. And so I basically laid in bed and slept for 18 to 20 hours, probably for a number of months. But after about 2 weeks of that, my husband was like, something's wrong. I think you need to see a doctor. This is not normal. And so I went and saw my physician, and she ruled out diabetes and hypertension and hypothyroidism and a variety of other things that kind of mimic depression. So she ruled all those out and said, Ms. Rasmus, I think you need to see a psychiatrist. And so I did. And my psychiatrist diagnosed me with a major depressive episode. The way that looked for me was literally as though my life fell apart in front of me. And when I say that, it was the internal life. It was the internal identity. Everything that I thought that had meaning no longer could get me out of bed. I didn't realize at that point we had been doing probably 50 funerals a year. It was at the height of the AIDS pandemic. And our church was one of the few African-American churches in the city of Houston that would eulogize a person who had died from the pandemic. There was just that much fear around it. And so we were doing 50 funerals a year. And so at points we were becoming friends, and then we were eulogizing the person. And so that was a major emotional toll for us. So we've got this grief going on. We've got, or when I say we, I mean me. But I say we because my husband and I were in this together. My children were in this with us. One of the things that I often say is that when one person in a family is diagnosed with a mental health illness, everybody is diagnosed in that family. And so we literally, so we were experiencing this grief and loss from the people that we were eulogizing in our congregation. In addition to that, you've got a performance addict who gets high, excited, thrilled when the carrot is dangled in front of her, right? And so here this church has become this huge carrot. I've often said to people, if I had been addicted to crack during that time, which was very much the other pandemic, if I had been addicted to crack, the church was the crack house. It was the place where I got all my highs, and then I came home and passed out. I didn't realize some things about myself, that the depression or the experience of depression became an invitation to learn. Number one, I was an introvert, but I lived like an extrovert. All the energy was always outside focused. And I, at the time, didn't know how to charge and recharge myself internally. And so that became a major lesson for me, a major learning for me. Not only that, I was dealing with the fact that my doctor says I burned out my adrenal glands during this time. And so I've got my body trying to recover from all these various illnesses that seem to be coming out of nowhere, lower back pain. I remember one day sitting on the sofa and I took a bite out of an apple. Now, I bit from the front of my mouth, but a tooth in the back of my mouth shattered in my mouth. And all of these various physical symptoms were ways that my body and mind and spirit were saying, we can't keep living like this. And so because I was ignoring the signs of fatigue and exhaustion, ignoring signs of not having interest in life and wondering why. Matter of fact, I can't tell you how many mornings I woke up thinking, is this all there is to life? And then you die? And there was an overwhelming sense of, I guess apathy might be a good word, but it was as though the life had been sucked out of me. And all I was a shell of the person that I had been. So this was a total disorientation, a total disruption of the way my life had been. I had always been a pretty joyful person, even though I didn't know joy. I knew how to smile, I knew how to laugh, but I didn't know joy. And I find that that's one of the gifts that I've been given as I've learned to move and live with a depression diagnosis, is that the lessons, one of the critical lessons was the necessity of joy and pursuing joy. I was a very rule-oriented, very rigid person, and I'm learning to color outside the lines. But I don't think that I would have gotten this lesson and the shifts towards a new orientation in my way of thinking and ultimately being in the world had it not been for this major depressive episode.
Thank you, Juanita. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I look forward to coming back to the joy part. But before we do that, Norm, is this, I know you see so many different people with depression, but you, if I understand well, one of the things that you're special about is that you notice differences between them. So how does this fit some of the people that you see, and what is the work that you've done with that?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much, Juanita, for sharing your personal experience. I'm sure it gets easier with time. It might not be easy. And yeah, we do see a lot of different ways depression manifests, and it really is an umbrella term, I think, for probably a lot of different ways things can go wrong. But there are some sort of common elements, and I'm really interested in what distinguishes, that moment of feeling empty or hopeless or intensely sad from that sort of sticking with someone, right? And you're getting kind of locked into that kind of syndrome that we would call, a depressive episode. And so we do a lot of brain imaging to look at what happens when we make people sad, and then try to see what's different in the brains of people who then go on or have increased vulnerability to become depressed from those who manage to find a way to recover and be resilient. And one of the things that we found that has been really surprising that we see over and over again is that depression is not so much being flooded with feeling, at least in terms of what it looks like in the brain, but much more a pattern where someone has learned to powerfully block out sensation as a way of coping. And so what seems like a solution in the short term, which is like, and this resonates, I think, completely with what Juanita was saying, was like, I'm just going to put my head down and get through. I just need to be a little bit tougher. I just need to like get better at compartmentalizing. There's all this language that we have about, which really amounts to, I need to just not sense anything right now. And if I can stay away from sensing something right now, I'll be safe. And so, and it's true, actually, people do feel a little safer in the moment when they are able to block out the sensation. But what we're seeing is that it's this signature of being really, really good at blocking out sensations, seeing the sensory parts of the brain turn off as people feel more sadness, like they're watching a sad film clip or thinking of a sad memory. It's this pattern of blocking out sensation that actually predicts being more vulnerable to depression in the long term. And so, the way we try to understand this is that while it makes sense to try to stay away from an unpleasant sensation, from feeling overwhelmed and feeling stressed, sensation is really the only way that we let the world change us, right? So when we let sensation in, what we're doing is we're saying the information from the world is more important than me being completely stable and perfect, because sensation is a part of our experience that we can't control. It's the world coming in. And so to block that out is to say the way I am now shouldn't change. But you can see where this becomes a problem, right? If I'm blocking things out because the way the world is right now is threatening, hopeless, overwhelming, disappointing, and my response to that is saying, well, I'm not going to change, then what I've done is I've locked myself in to a place where the meanings in life are hopeless, overwhelming, powerless, and so on and so forth. And so it doesn't seem natural for someone, I think, when they're feeling all these things and have this story about how their life is going and what's the point of life and all of these sorts of understandable reactions, to then say, well, I'm going to even take in more information because what's been coming in has been really threatening. So this creates a recipe for being locked into one way of being. And it's not that all sensation is good and helpful. A lot of times things come in from the world are either ambiguous or sometimes are harmful, and we don't want to just take everything in. But the solution cannot be to say, well, I'm never going to take in more information. And I don't think this is like an explicit choice. It's like a defense mechanism that builds up over time. And what we see in a stressed person who's still fairly functional is they have some ability to still move into sensation without a lot of training. But when we study people who have a history of depression, so they've had full episodes of depression 2, 3, 4 times before in their life, even with training, they can't really easily recover the ability to fully sense things. And this is where this feeling of, I think, I was trying to take a couple of this, but a feeling like apathy, or sometimes you call it anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure, like the life is sucked out of you. This is like the calcification, right? The hardening of the tendency to block out sensation in response to stress. And so when we try to work with people who have a history of depression, the very first thing they can learn is just to stop trying to block out, like stop reinforcing this habit. But it might take more than a day, a week, or months before you really let the mind actually becomes open again to new sensation. And so I think it's actually a growing field of not just trying to tell people to stop doing the things that are bad for them, like avoiding sensory experience, for instance, but also how do we develop skills that help us actually go out and forage for positive experience, because we need to almost rebuild that ability. And so when you were saying towards the end, what you realized is you actually had to be like intentional, like about trying to find joy. Like that's exactly it. Another way to think about that is I'm trying to rebuild a trust and skillfulness in taking in sensation, and actually almost as though I'm going to like the shopping at the grocery store or something. And so now there's a chance for me to find positive experiences. There's chances for me to find meaning, because that stuff is never going to just magically appear if we're not letting things in. So we can see this playing out in the brain, and we can see very strongly the blocking out part, and we can even see with some training people stop actively blocking out. But I think it might, within even a year or two, it's not clear that sensation gets fully restored. I think there needs to be additional practices that we're still exploring and trying to develop, and I think there's a lot of different ways to access those practices.
Thank you. And amazing how those things that keep us feel protected for a while, they are the same ones that don't allow us to really feel what we need. Rinpoche, I was wondering, is there a word for depression in Tibetan? And you grew up in an incredible environment, unusual to many of us, which is in a monastery, and is such a, whether you call it depression or another feeling, and how is it dealt with in that environment? How if you can talk some about that, if that would be very useful.
Thank you. Welcome. So, well, in monastery, I never heard the word depression. So if you think about English term word depression, the equivalent to, I'm not sure in Tibetan what that would be. This sense of the symptoms of depression, like being sad, less motivated, physical symptoms, lack of sleep, lack of appetite, those things are possible. But we don't have this idea of diagnosing something like a depression. But when these symptoms happen, I think in a community generally, we are each other's therapist, we are each other's doctor, we are each other's support, mentor. The community in some sense, it's like a helping, listening, that process is, I think, there, which is kind of healthy, which sometimes feels like a luck in the West generally, but then you have professionals here. So I think generally, definitely there is a depression there, for no question about it. But it's question about how pervasive it is, how deep it is, how people kind of deal with it. It's hard to know. These discussions we did not grow up doing those things. So I just wanted to go back one idea of this sense of what I'm interested in it, and this sense of how we can prevent. Probably there's a lot of people right now listening, or there are a lot of people who are not listening. They might think, who wanted to listen to the depression? I'll get depressed whenever listening to these talks, right? So they don't, that doesn't mean they don't feel sad. That doesn't feel they're, not motivated, maybe a big problem of sleep deprivation nowadays, and so on. But people don't pay early symptoms, or maybe they go into those bad moods, but you're not diagnosed as a depression. It's not a disorder yet, but still you're in a bad mood, you're less motivated, you lack sleep, all these symptoms are there. It's the matter of time, could be diagnosed, right? So how do we prevent? I think that's one question. Or how do we really handle sometime if you are less motivated in doing anything, or if you are less joyful, if you feel you're not sleeping. So these are kind of going toward that situation, right? So what do you do when you feel like that? I think those will be good to maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I always talk about like a children who goes to the Disneyland first time, right? Who is totally excited to go to Disneyland first time. So then next week is the date. They know exactly which date and day it is, so you are looking forward to it. Every day you get so excited about it, going there. And then that night before, you can almost not go to sleep. You wake up in the morning with such enthusiasm and joy. I said, that's how we should get up every morning. Life is like a Disneyland. It's a wonder. An incredible opportunity to be happy, be grateful, to be helpful. So much incredible opportunity every single day we have, no question about it. But do we feel that? Do you sense that? Do you act on them? Do you feel the benefit of acting on them? That's the question, right? So I think, if even you look at the days, Sunday evening, how do you feel Sunday evening? People who work like a full-time 9 to 5, Sunday evening is not a fun evening, right? You have to think about Monday is already there. You look at your mood. You can feel that energy. And the Monday morning, you can feel that energy, what I call a collective professional pain body, manifesting it all together at 9 o'clock. Like you can see the people's eyes, face, the body postures, the voice, how they interact with each other. You can see this lack of motivation and joy symptoms is pervasive. And so when you're aware of that, how you feel that, then what do you do? Or what do you do in general to just stay away from those feelings? How you motivate throughout the day, everyday life, So it's not like I personally, I know sometimes I feel like, this sense of that lack of joy or lack of motivated or some sense of low sadness. Yeah, those feelings are there. I notice sometimes. And when it's there, what do you do? Of course, I personally, I first most important thing is I recognize, and then the second thing is as Norman said that the idea we always talk in the teaching, not block any experiences, but not to identify any experiences either, because when you're identifying with experiences, that's you're getting deeper into trouble. But when you're blocking experiences, you are not healing them. So these two pieces I see critical, not blocking the experience, letting it feel, but not identifying with it. Because when you don't identify with it, you are the host who is processing it to let it go. When you're identifying with it, you become that problem. You cannot let it go because you are it. So I think is a pieces I feel very important. I hope we can talk more of it.
Thank you, Rinpoche. Well, I think, Juanita, that's a little bit what you did, and if you want to talk and how you learned to be, as your book says, I met you, during one of your difficult parts of life, and I saw you really engaging with meditation and other practices, and how that helps. So, whatever you want to share of your journey.
Well, thank you. And Rinpoche, you were absolutely right when you were talking about the energy of blocking, trying to block. I had used a lot of energy looking back, because retrospectively we can see everything, right? So when I look back, I see I used a lot of energy blocking feelings that I didn't think I was allowed to have. As a pastor, I didn't think I had permission to grieve publicly the losses of our members of our congregation and friends and so forth. And so all of the narrative that I had created in childhood blew up in adulthood. And the reality is the depression helped blow it up. It helped to say to me, there are other ways of being, and the way you're doing it is killing you. It's sucking the life out of you. I like that term, because in Texas, people are very familiar with eating crawfish and sucking the good out of that fish, right? And so that idea that then you cast away the empty shell. Well, I was the empty shell, and I didn't want to be cast away, right? And so I recognized, through the help of not only my therapist, I took some medication. I had a psychiatrist. I also had a spiritual director, and talk therapy was one of the practices that helped me to unravel this ball of untruth that had become my identity, or I had believed was who I was, right? And so one of the practices, in addition to the talk therapy, was meditation. I learned that during my time at home, which I was at home for almost 3 years, the intensity of this was probably about a 9-month period of time. And what I came to recognize is that the tradition, my faith tradition, calls this the dark night of the soul. And so this was a place where I was being given the opportunity to reconstruct identity beyond ego identity. Now, the silence was the other practice that I didn't knowingly select, but it became my practice because every morning my family would go to school, my girls would go to school, my husband would go to work. I was at home all day long by myself. And I wasn't watching TV. I wasn't checking my phone because I didn't have the mental capacity at that point to process doing any of those things. And so I was literally embedded in silence. I was embedded in solitude. And it was in the silence and solitude, and then ultimately a more, if you want to say, refined practice. I don't know if that's an appropriate word, because the silence and solitude were the great practice. But then later I learned that I could create that kind of space through a formal meditation practice. And so many practices came out of this for me, and I talk about them in my book because so many people aren't aware that these practices are available and can be used in moments like this, in times like this. And so for me, the silence helped me to hear the still small voice. I call that voice God. And that voice asked me really two important questions that I was given the time and the space to ponder. Number one, who am I? Who am I? Because I had been identifying myself with the roles that I played, the things I could do, my shoulds, my to-do list, my have-tos, got-tos, ought-to-dos. And that left no question of inquiry for joy. And I know we'll talk about that in a moment, but I feel it's so critical because my life was simply a to-do list. Checking off my children's birthday parties. Did I buy everything they needed? Checking off the next meeting, checking off the board meetings, checking off presentations, checking off sermons. There was no space for cultivating joy. And so in the practice of the silence and the deep solitude, I was able to be asked the second question, and that was, what would you love? You see, I hadn't been living a life based on what I would love. I would go to the same restaurant and the waiters got so used to me ordering the same thing. They'd say, would you like your regular? And so I wasn't even making space for anything new, anything exciting, and this is a practice that I'm learning about. I wasn't exercising the practice of anticipation. My husband was really good at that. And so I started noticing how he woke up with joy every morning. And I'm thinking to myself, what world is he living in? Because I couldn't relate to that at all. But again, it was part of my childhood narrative to be task-oriented, to get the job done. And there, matter of fact, I'll say it this way. My father recently, he's 81 years old, told me that of all the things he taught me about business, he wished he had taught my sister and I how to play. Because play wasn't in my vocabulary. And so the practice of play, the necessity of meditation on a daily basis, dropping into the place where I'm grounded. Matter of fact, I keep this on my desk. And it's a bottle of water with some bubbles, some dishwashing liquid in it. And you see how cloudy that becomes? My life was cloudy. But I realized that in meditation, that if I would invest time just being still, being with my breath, that in a matter of time, that all the cloudiness would become very clear. It would be clear to me what was mine to do. It would be clear to me what I was to accept as a yes in my life and what I was to accept as a no. It was in the meditation that I realized that I needed to create spaciousness in my life so that I could play in ways that were life-giving to me. You talked about blocking emotion, Norm. One of the things I had learned to do because I was molested as a little girl is block emotion. I didn't realize that that would have long-term effects on my well-being, right? I'm grateful that you talked about the coping mechanism aspects of depression, because that's one of the things my therapist said. Juanita, depression is often a coping mechanism. And so, again, it's these practices of silence. It's the practice of solitude. It's the practice of meditation, where I would be given insight as to how to begin to reorient my life after what felt like the bottom had fallen out of it. So the practices are significant. And I think that that's the richness of this conversation, is to invite people to see that this is a place of transformation. You can either become the diagnosis, or you can use the diagnosis to become.
Thank you. Thank you. Norm, what are some of the interventions, as we call it, in that realm? What do you bring as tools to shift that, to realize the armor that one has put to it for themselves, and how to be able to open up and reconnect to themselves and hopefully to their joy?
Yeah, I mean, I think we initially thought that there was something unique about like a mindfulness tradition that was different than all other traditions. And what we've come to understand over the past decade or so of looking at many different types of interventions, cognitive therapy, nature-based therapies, mindfulness therapies, is that there's certain common elements that I think are probably more important to focus on than the branding or the name of the therapy or the practice. It doesn't have to be a formal therapy. And we've sort of identified two kind of components that are really important that I think resonate a bit with what both Juanita and Tenzin have been saying. One of them is this ability to not immediately identify with experience, right? And this is called many different things across different wisdom traditions. You see the term decentering, cognitive diffusion, perspective taking, is the ability to watch your experience and have a bit of space, and having that silence, having that space can be absolutely essential, especially when you're just beginning, right? So there's lots of things distracting you. It's very hard not to react. And a reaction means I know what is going on and I know how to respond. So you're already identified with the experience. If you're just reacting to things, they come in. So, but it's also not just like attention with no emotion, which I think is how often it's taught. What we see just through statistical analysis of how different qualities move when people fill out questionnaires is that this ability to decenter or de-identify with experience, when it's growing, always grows with a sort of positivity. So it's like it's a befriending or a curiosity. And if it's just I'm just going to watch things and not feel things, it may be like seem like you're decentering or de-identifying, but you may also just be blocking, right? So it's the ability to be curious and friendly, or try to have a positive attitude around discovering what it is that is happening in your experience, and having that attitude seems like it lets you then have a bit of relief because you don't have to do anything about things. And that's why sometimes protecting yourself and being in a safer space or quieter space can be useful. But also then you can notice patterns, right? And you can say, oh, here is how I've been programmed to defend myself, right? Or here is the tendency that I used, and it's not getting me what I want, right? Whatever that is in life. And so this decentering quality or capacity seems to be really, really important. And it's more important that we see a growth in decentering than it is that you do like just this one intervention or just this one religious practice or clinical psychology intervention or whatever it is. It's finding the practice that gives you access to growth in this ability to watch what's happening and be kind of curious and almost like pleasantly surprised, I guess would be the one way to describe how it should feel. Like you're like, oh, I didn't know that. It's like, oh, I didn't know that this was happening, or I didn't realize this is really how I was reacting, or this is my pattern. And so any type of practice where we are willing to suspend knowing exactly what's going on and be open to sensation, and that can be external feelings, but it can also be feelings in our body. It could be thoughts or judgments that bubble up, and look at that as a process of discovery. I think is putting someone on the right track. And the companion sort of capacity that comes with that is this ability to more at least tolerate, if not fully like accept, or have some, or the term also equanimity is used quite a bit too. So to be able to not feel as though it's so strong that you have to react. So bringing awareness in a friendly or curious way, paired with the ability to tolerate what you find, are kind of the twin skills that we see, at least from a Western science perspective, that if they grow together, we're starting to see resilience form. Because telling someone open up to experience, have this awareness, and be friendly when it feels overwhelming and it feels threatening, it's never going to work. And I think this is part of why having a setting where you remove yourself from everything that you're conditioned to responding to in life, whether that's through therapy or retreat or travel or whatever it is, can be really important early on, because it may be overwhelming, the need to respond or the need to defend or the need to protect. And then over time, I think what's really magic that Nina was mentioning is you realize, wow, even now when things are busy, now I have this ability to shift into this mode where I can notice and explore and try to make friends with whatever it is I'm experiencing. Not that I want it there all the time, or I treasure like a feeling of anger or hatred or something like that. But I just feel like it's more important that I see clearly than it is for me to feel good all the time. And that can be something you can bring more and more into everyday life. And in fact, that's probably where the difference is going to be made when you're in conversation with someone, when someone does something you don't like. But to develop these skills, sometimes it's nice to sort of scaffold or augment your ability not to react by having that separation. And that's maybe why something like depression could actually be, at least in the short term, a very helpful kind of response, as long as it doesn't stretch out, for months and years and years and years. But it may actually be your body and your forcing you to pull away so that you have a chance to sort of regroup and find these new sort of skills. So yeah, go ahead.
Question to Norman. When what you're talking here, are you talking from the perspective of as a neuroscientist, the activity in the brain, the differences from where you are keeping it neutral for being open or being curious or being ability to guide? So any different activities happening in the brain, just be curious about if that, or yeah.
I think the strongest evidence is more from, we have different like questionnaires and from self-reports. So we're hearing this more from people articulating their own experience. It doesn't map as neatly into the brain as we would like. But one thing we definitely see that goes with this in the brain is that there doesn't have to be a trade-off between understanding and sensing. A lot of times, the more we feel like we need to understand or control something, the less we allow metabolism in the brain to go to the parts that represent new information. Like, I have enough, I'm going to control it and fix it. So it's not that we are trying to get rid of conceptual thought or evaluation, but we don't want that to be the network in the brain that is getting all of the resources. We want there to be a balance. And so, because sometimes people interpret it as like, well, I should just stop thinking, I should just go fully sensing. And we can definitely distinguish between the thinking, judging parts of the brain and the sensing parts of the brain. And it's the pattern of a lot of thinking and no sensing that seems to be a non-decentered state. All that exists is a story. So you already identified with the experience. You already have a fixed interpretation of the way things are. If you have a story, we can't help not having stories or explanations, but there's also new information coming in that's disrupting and perturbing the story. Now you need the story or the evaluation or the judgments to occur that's part of how we have meanings as human beings, but now it's more flexible, right? It's always, and you're not controlling necessarily where the story goes all the time. And that's a recipe for being at least able to change. And if you can change, there's a chance for resilience. Yeah. So I think
one more additional question here will be, so a whole notion of a need to allow to express it in order to so it can be clear, it can rewire and whatever. In terms of do you think that more important in a physical sense, like in a brain or in the body, than thoughts and emotion? I mean, from the point of view of the teaching, like in a Dzogchen, it always says the same thing, like a body and speech and the mind. It says, these emotions are called dynamic energy. They're not called like a negative, destructive emotions or something like that. At least in a Dzogchen tradition, they're called dynamic energy. So you don't stop them, you guide them. But I'm wondering more from your background, there's more need to see when it comes to the body. For example, in antidepressant, like when it comes to physical, then the medicine is necessary. But until then, maybe there's more, maybe physical, medicine is a choice. Maybe there is a little choice. At some point, there's no choice, right?
Yeah, I think if I understand correctly, yeah, you need both, right? You need to have and really I see the feelings, like the sensations lead to feelings, right? And I think Western psychology and my understanding of some Eastern psychology fit really well here. Every sensation is going to have some sort of conditioned approach or avoidance and feeling associated with it. And that this is the energy where change comes from. And you wouldn't only want change energy, right? That's very disorganized being, right? But to not have, but my perception is in the West and in the people we study, the problem is much more often that the change energy is blocked out. I don't know if that's a primary, condition for all human beings. And there are disorders like depersonalization or derealization where you see so much, like all that's happening is sensation with no interpretation. That's also very debilitating, I should say. But the prevalence of those disorders is very small in the West compared to depression and anxiety, which are disorders where there's a lot of interpretation and very little change. So I think for each person, it's about striking a balance. But if I didn't know the person at all, I would guess the problem is not enough change, not that there's too much change energy. But yeah, you wouldn't want to say 100%, just more and more change all the time until you don't understand anything. Like that also is not useful. So it's about us learning that there are two modes and we have to find a way to balance them. The same way that you wouldn't, I often use muscles as a metaphor. So you don't want just the extending part of your arm to work and not the contracting. And you don't want just the contracting to work with not extending. An arm needs both, right? So why do we think like, oh, I'm just going to get really good at concepts and understanding, but I won't practice changing myself. And also, I'll just always change myself, but I won't have any stability. Like it doesn't make sense. We need both. So I think we're looking for a profile of a brain that can switch between these modes. Yeah.
Can I ask one question to Juanita? So, just a simple question. I think when you're overcoming with your depression, what are the day-to-day activity motivation that help you? Sometimes people, it's a question about what you do. I mean, idea is not to identify with what you do, to-do list and everything. But on the other hand, we do things, I do things in my life, but I definitely also trying to have so much time for myself when I don't do nothing, or when I do things which other people think it's not a productive thing to do, but it's very joyful, very creative thing for me to do. Just a writing, for example. I don't know, So what are the things that practical every day you would do, that get up and do things that which was really supportive?
Well, keep in mind that for the first 9 months or so, I really wasn't able to do much of anything.
Sure.
But after a point when I could begin to feel some stamina and that kind of thing, one of the things was that I started a garden, and it started very small. And believe me, it was like one plant. And I was trying to keep that plant alive and keep me alive, right? But what it did was it got me outside, because I found out that often people who are experiencing depression have vitamin D deficiencies. And so I started going outside. And sometimes it would take everything in me to sit outside. to get to the door to get outside. And so I just kind of began to sit in nature. And I found that to be very healing. Over time, it was a living meditation. And I mean, literally seeing animals in the yard, the squirrels and that kind of thing would often be intriguing to me in a way that I had not known it before. And so it was like a part of me was waking up to a new kind of reality. And so being outside was one of those clear ways that I sensed that. I'm trying to think, one of the other things that I did once I was more functioning is I started volunteering once a week. I wasn't at work. I wasn't going to work. I didn't have that capacity yet. But I started volunteering one time a week with adults who had learning disabilities. And we were painting pottery. It was very simple. It was a very simple thing, but creativity, engaging in a creative act. I found that to be very life-giving. And it was fueling my tank, my life tank again. And so those two things I can tell you right off the bat, being in nature and engaging in creativity, which are all things that as a child I did. One of the things, I'll say this to you in this way, and as I've shared with others, what did you love doing as a child? What were the activities that you engaged in that gave you joy? That I encourage you to go back and do some of those things. One of the other things for me, now this was way off the charts for some, but I loved adventure as a kid. I hadn't had any adventure. And one of the things I loved to do when I was a kid was to climb on my grandmother's porch, which was about 4 steps high. It was concrete and she had pillars on both sides. I would climb onto those pillars and I'd jump off. And I loved the ecstasy of that. The adventurous side of my nature is another aspect of how I begin to tap into that deepness within me, that well of possibility, the well that was my real self. And as I tapped into both nature and creativity and adventure, I found myself coming alive. Thanks for that question.
I think there was somebody saying, what about isolation? So in generally, what you're saying is whenever we feel sense of isolation, what you were talking earlier about meditation, silence, and silence is where it is a meditation. Silence is where you hear your voice. Silence is where you see new ideas and creativity. So, but idea will be taking a baby step, as you said. It's not think you have to do big things. You have to, one plant is enough. I think that's what I think is very important, Alex. Yeah.
And can I say also about the silence and solitude? People often ask me, how do I take on silence? How do I engage in that? And I'll often say, what about 5 minutes? Turn off your cell phone, turn off your computer, and for 5 minutes, follow your breath. Noticing your inhales, noticing the exhale, and let the only sound you hear be your breath. And so I have gone on silent retreats for up to a week, but I don't recommend that for everybody. It, like you said, Rinpoche, it's a matter of building on. You find out that it provides some life-giving qualities for you, and so then maybe you add a few more minutes to it, or you decide to go for a few hours, but it is a building upon. It's a practice, and so yes, definitely building upon.
I'll just add, in our tradition, sometimes we say silence is a music. Silence is a joy. Silence is a light. Silence is where you hear your voice. So silence is not an absence of noise. Silence is the presence of melody.
And it's connecting with that rhythm. I think for many of us, we've been, especially in the West, we've been very external focused. So it's find your rhythm out there somewhere. Find your beat out there somewhere. And what silence has taught me is that the rhythm is already in me. And so what I'm doing is tapping down into that rhythm and enjoying it and receiving the life from it so that I can then be discerning about the task, the dues that I have before me. So yes, thank you for that.
Beautiful. Thank you. Norm, I wanted to ask you about this decentering. And is there a time where there's a recentering, right? Because at some point there's this part of coming back to a sense of rebuilding, as Juanita was saying, right? This way of rebuilding who you are, or rebuilding a sense of reconnecting. And I find that sometimes, at least in common parlance, there's a lot of use of recentering, or coming back to your center. If you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting term. I haven't seen like in academic literature as much the idea of recentering, but I think that the idea is definitely there. And again, it's like there's these two things we want to be able to do. Is one is to move from a space of knowing too well the way we are or the world is, and to destabilize what we know by taking in new information. And that's where decentering is, where you're stepping away from how you would normally perceive things to be, more inquiring and expansive. But then the purpose of this, as I was saying, is not to get rid of all of our meanings and understanding, but to find that we can select new meanings, right? New actions, new ways of looking at things, and experiment with those. And then if we find something, we're like, yeah, this really works, right? Like, oh, this way of being with my kids, or this way of acting at work, or this way of dealing with frustration is something I would choose over the way I'm used to doing things. And we are willing to practice that. We would want to eventually, and it will be natural if we practice things, to re-automatize, right? To form new habits. And the set of habits that we have really is kind of like our center, right? And that's what's familiar and that's what's comfortable. And if all of our habits were exactly what we chose, you could say, maybe you don't even need to have, this awareness or something like that. But still, like, it would be good to check in and monitor what's happening, which needs a bit of decentering. So the way we look at it is there's decentering to destabilize a system that is sort of too fixed. And then there's there's an opportunity for like appraisal, or meaning making, right? Finding new meanings, which you could be looking at as recentering. And it's not just like made up, right? I think this fits back with what Nita was saying with her first two kind of activities. It has to come from the reality, right? The perceived reality, right? And so even in very, non-contemplative Western clinical psychology, there's a growth in behavioral activation therapies, which is like, do something basic, but that is achievable. And why do you do this? Because you can't just tell, if you believe, like, if you're centered on the perception that I'm worthless, let's say, I never get anything done. And someone says, well, you just need to decenter from that. You're like, okay, so now I watch myself telling myself I'm worthless. And then they say, okay, now you're done. You're fine. Well, nothing new has happened. And if you just try to say, like, in your head, oh, I disagree, or I'm not worthless, like, your mind knows, like, but you have all this experience where you saw yourself as worthless. You have nothing where you had value. So the recentering is to center upon something else in reality that provides that's more empowering, right? That helps you live a life that is more aligned with your values. And that could be like, I'm worthless, I never do anything, but today, like, for 10 minutes, I went outside. So it cannot be true anymore that I'm 100% worthless. Now, if I let myself center just naturally, I'm 99% worthless, but 1% of me is doing something. Oh, okay, so I'm not 100% worthless. And then the next time you practice, now I'm 98% worthless. I'm 2%, I do something. And then that starts to build a momentum. So the centering, I think, happens naturally. We fall back into our habits whenever we're not putting energy into taking in the sensation, right, and taking in new experiences. And the question is, like, well, what are we centering back onto, and is there more work to be done? And arguably, there's always a little bit of work to be done, but sometimes a lot of the work is there, and things are working pretty well, and we're like, oh, I'm actually being the person I wished I wanted to be. And other times we're very far from that, but the process is the same. Like, let yourself open up and notice what else is available, and then try to pay attention to the things that you want to develop habits around. So you start feeding your attention into things that are positive, that lead to connection, that lead to meaning, that lead to even a comfort with not knowing. And if you can start to develop those sorts of habits, it becomes easier and easier to finally start to become the person you always thought was out there, that was inaccessible, and that becomes your center. So I would, to just sum that all up, I think your habits are your center. It's natural you will fall back into that state, and all we're trying to sort of express is that there is this wonderful opportunity to sort of shift that center, first by decentering and then attending, doing something a little bit different, so that there's a real experience that doesn't fit in with the old narrative. And then when you recenter, it's a little bit different. Every time you're a little bit different. And if you're intentional, you can guide a bit where you pay attention and how you change over time.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, being open, guiding your attention, doing it slow, a step at a time, a plant at a time. The Tibetans have this kale, slowly. So I really love that. I wanted to come to something that Rinpoche mentioned that worked. Yes, if I can say one thing, Rinpoche, and Al, because you said this about community, and I think it's so important. And I find, there's many studies about social support, how important it is. And many traditional societies find that that's medicine, being in the community. So if we want to talk a little bit, maybe, I know Rinpoche had his hand up too. So if, I don't know if it has to do with that or, but if you want to talk a little bit on that, and that I think will be important, because I find that both the literature and a lot of the people that I talk to find that is important with depression, but also even, going through COVID, for example. So yes,
so just we can come back to that, but just what Norman talking about centering, decentering, recentering. In order to talk all of that, first we need to know what center is, right? If you don't know what center is, then how you can decenter, recenter, anything. So I think that's a big question, and I don't think most of the time whenever we are talking, we're not very clear about what that is. So let's say this way: idea of people living their life. They say, "I don't have a problem with depression. I'm successful. I have done a lot of things. I'm making money. I'm whatever." They think there's no. They feel they are in center, but many times I see people like that. And I don't think they are in center, because they are totally driven. They definitely have a lot of fire. They definitely have a lot of creativity. They definitely it looks like a happy, but I'm not sure they're happy. But they're living life, and some of these people definitely need to decenter, recenter. So the question, I think, from the Dharma point of view, is every now and then, no matter who it is, somebody is going through depression or not, we all need to look ourselves. We do need to do kind of decenter a little bit. Wherever you think you are feeling so stable, you are doing so well, and you're identifying with that, whatever situation is, you have to decenter from that in order to prevent future problems, because that's not the center that you think what your center is. That's not where your joy is. That's not where your service is. That's not where your meaning of life is. That's more where socially accepted, well-placed, recognized place you're in. That's not your center. That is a totally, like, it can like a bank's, Silicon Valley Bank, like we think about the center is gone. The world is shaking. Our sense of center, like if you look in Europe, old towns, they call it centro, right? Centro is where the cathedrals are. In America, where is the center? It's a downtown where the banks are. The notion of center has changed. And notion of center, we look at in our own life, everybody has a different sense of center. And whatever center you think, you have to decenter every now and then. It's like an oil change.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rinpoche. Yeah, and actually this goes perfect with community, right? Because if we think of the concept of mandala, it's center and periphery, the community that supports the center, and that dynamic energy between them. And I was wondering, I mean, Rinpoche mentioned it, how important it was in the monastery. Juanita, you lead a community, and it was within that you, as you said, fell apart. But how much was the community helpful in helping you regroup, or did you find a different community that helped you regroup?
There was some support from our community in the ways that they could, but for the most part, I was pretty isolated from our faith community. And as you said, I found new community. I found people who were meditating and that was supporting my meditation practice. I found yoga and people who were practicing yoga. I found gardeners and people who were teaching me about gardening. And so as I found community, it was the creation of a new community for me, because I had never pursued a yoga community or a meditation community. I had never pursued a gardening community because I killed rubber plants at that point, plastic plants, And so I was grateful to begin to find this burgeoning new community and the energy that it brought to support me on my journey. It was amazing. Matter of fact, one of those communities was the American Leadership Forum, ALF, here in Houston, became one of my communities. And that was almost kind of an unintentional community. But I had a few years come out of the dark night of the soul, and here this community was surrounding me, who we were all leaders in commerce and so forth, in society in Houston. And that community became another place for me. Because one of the things that community did is we did some nature experiences. And so those nature experiences took my little sitting outside on the patio to the next level. We went mountain climbing together and hiking together. And so they became another sense of community. So yes, community is important. I wish that I had known about, as an example, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI. It's a national organization. It's peer supported. People who have either had a mental health diagnosis or have someone in their family. We now have NAMI at St. John's because we recognize that we need community support. We heal together. And I love the way, as you were speaking, Rinpoche, you were saying how we may have these feelings, but we become present for each other in the community. So we don't have to, in essence, get a diagnosis. We're present for one another, guiding each other through, sharing. One of the best things that I ever heard was that in order for us to help one another heal, become a good listener. And that's what community can do for us.
Thank you. I know we're coming the end. I wanted to see first, Norm, is community, is that one of the areas that you also bring into the studies, or is that, I don't know, or do you consider it? Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, the place where people start learning on this path from our, like, the clinical psychology model is still in these sort of group therapies. So that becomes a community where you have shared suffering is actually what brings you together. Like, you're not there because everything's so great, you decided to sign up for a depression relapse prevention course. So there's something really nice about learning to be with other people. And one of the main ground rules in these groups is you're not there to fix the other people in the group. So if someone says something and it's like, and this is true of a lot of mindfulness courses too, is someone says something and the intuition is like, I want to get rid of that suffering. I want to get rid of it. So I'm going to tell you what you should do. And so one of the first things people learn is to be in community, and there's nothing that you need to do, right? Like other than just be here together. And that, I suspect, actually does a lot of the work that we have all these other complicated mechanisms and things like that. There's a lot of work being done just being somewhere where other people are not demanding you to do anything other than just be present, right? You're modeling for each other, and you're making mistakes, and but it's okay. You made a mistake, right? You said something, you judged someone, you tried to fix. It's okay. That's even that part's okay. So this idea of like, it's just okay to be here, and it's even okay to make mistakes, trying to learn how to just be here together is so rich, right? And I don't think we have a ton of like, formal variables measuring that. It's already like built into a model that we know is helpful. And yes, you can do a lot of these practices one-on-one, right? You can try to do them with apps, which is 1-on-0. But we know that the group works very, very well. And a skilled, therapist or family member, someone else can also help. But there's something beautiful about being around people you don't know who are weird because they also had a breakdown or something happened, and it's okay, right? It's a totally different set of rules, which I think is really rich. I do think that at least in the West, we need to do more work about the places we look to build. Like once we decenter where we want to build, the idea that if we just scrape away enough, we're going to be complete on our own, I think is not enough of. It's not an accurate story. Almost all of our feelings of well-being come from our interactions with other people, right? Being accepted or being rejected, being judged as worthy, judged as unworthy, and then we internalize that, and we have a little, a simulacrum of what the average outsider would think of us, and then we judge ourselves. We don't even need someone there to do it. So this idea that we have well-being even outside of relationships, I think is wrong. I think most of our sense of well-being and meaning and purpose all comes relative to how we think we're being seen. And so there's a lot of growth in compassion, loving kindness traditions, but in the West they didn't start off together, which is very strange from my reading of the history. Right? You wouldn't teach in Eastern tradition. Please, Rinpoche, you can correct me or add to this. You wouldn't teach someone just decenter and get rid of judgment and deconstruct, and then when you get distressed, just watch it more. Like it was always that the urge to help, to be compassionate, to bring a connection is the solution to a lot of these kind of problems, or it is a solution. And we're just starting to bring these two ideas together. That part of it is destabilizing what we know, but then what are we going to fill it in with? Well, it's the desire to connect and help and support each other. And that is the most enduring kind of most powerful act we can have to actually make ourselves feel better. And I don't think we really know how to teach that properly yet. I think a lot of people believe it, but they believe it already because they have a lived experience. How do you bring someone in the secular West to that experience is still like a work in progress.
Thank you. So as we come to a close, I don't know if any of you, Rinpoche, Juanita, want to, even Norm, anything else that you wanted to add?
I think for me, one of the things that I have grown to realize is that so often when we experience disorientation, disruption, a diagnosis, a divorce, whatever it is that might be happening that turns our world upside down, we often want to just find a quick Band-Aid and then return to the old way, right? When the reality is the experience is never designed to cause you to return to the old way. The children's story, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. They weren't supposed to be able to put Humpty together again, because then they would have made the same old Humpty. The reality is this opportunity. And that's the thing I really like to inform people on. See the crisis as an opportunity to gain this kind of skills that Norm has talked about, an opportunity for the kind of cultivating of a center of the self that's already present, but that is in raw form. And so for me, see the diagnosis as an invitation. Who am I being invited to become? And what would I absolutely love to have showing up in my life? And I think as a person begins to have that as a trajectory versus the getting caught up in all the medications and do they work or do they not work? And I can't sleep when I take that one and I can't eat when I take that one. You can get caught up in the disruption instead of the possibilities and the opportunities that the disruption is designed to create. So thank you.
Thank you. Lovely. Rinpoche.
So from the point of view of the teaching, it states that I am no one. So everything that I identify with is not me. So I am no one. So me being no one is my center. In that being no one, then there is someone, something happened, there's someone there. That's my second center or temporary center. And then there's something happened. That's another center. There's something else, another center. So all these different experiences of my life, in a way, they're not interfering with each other. They're always kind of supporting each other, but none of them is my center. My center is the basis where it gives birth to all of these things. I think that's a very important point to recognize from the point of view of the teaching. Let's give my experiences of my own life, okay? I'm just thinking about it when we're talking about the center. I understand from a philosophical point of view, but I wanted to see what in life, what will be it means to everybody else, how it understand. You know, when we're talking center, everybody's talking about this center. So if I look at my life, you know, first of all, in my life, I don't remember being anyone except then I just suddenly I realized I'm a child of refugee family, just escaped Tibet and struggling in India, end up in the monastery, you know, like nobody cared in some sense. You are just there in the monastery. You find yourself in the monastery. Who am I? I'm this little monk who did not know how to wear a robe, who just felt sad about losing his beautiful hair. They just cut it. And that's who I was. And whole half of my life grew up in the monastery as a monk. And that was who I was. My center was a monk, going to dialectic school, trying to do study and live just the monastic life. That was my center. And after, you know, until I was 26, 27, when I first graduated, and suddenly that was a big part of my life. You finished, and suddenly it kind of very disorienting a little bit. Okay, now what? You have this routine of 26 years until 26, 7 years old. Now you suddenly, you don't have any more schedule, no classes to attend. Very decentering, right? Then you start another one. Then the big thing is you come to the West. You're alone, you know, and then finally you get married. Now you are husband. Then you have a child. Now my center is growing. Now from big community to nothing to now it's building up another community. Like now I have a child. Now you become this. My center was this family. My center was this community that we created. So it keeps changing continuously. But I feel this point in my life, I do feel my center is none of them. I feel my center is myself, that which gives birth to every experiences of my life, which I beautifully, joyfully, gratefully embrace and be with all my happiness and love. And that's my center. But not to identify with any of these things, because I can see, you know, you have a teenage, 17 year later, they're gone, decentralizing again. So I think it's good to basically, in short, what I'm trying to say, one word, everything what you think is a center, don't think is a center. Everybody who is a little bit feeling sad and not happy, not motivated, just be with that, as Juanita said, be with that. More give it what I call it spacious, luminous, warm hug. So that becomes more alive and finds more creativity. Yeah, that's
Wonderful.
all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rinpoche. That's great, including all from decentering and being no one and having the opportunity of all that you can be. So thank you very much, each of you. Thank you, all the viewers and listeners. Rinpoche will be on April 4th in Cyber Sangha at noon in New York Times, talking and giving meditation practice on embracing anxiety and cultivating calmness. So today, this month was on depression. Next month will be on anxiety, and then we'll also have a dialogue with Dr. Judd Brewer and Friedman. So we'll wait for you there. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone who made this possible.
Thank you.
Nilos, Polly, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Cyber Sangha podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Cyber Sangha, visit us online at cybersangha.net.